free to put those in the chat as well. So for now, without further ado, I'd like to ask our wonderful panelists to introduce themselves. We'll start with Gary Franchione.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm with Roar Wines and a couple of vineyards called Rosellas and Gary's, and Syrah and Sobranis. And pass it on to the next person. Or am I starting out?
Well, Scott.
Scott Caraccioli with Caraccioli Cellars and a Skoll Vineyard.
Annie, how about you?
Hi, everyone. I'm Annie Lee. I'm with Morgan Winery and Double L Vineyards.
And Michelle.
Hi, I'm Michelle. I'm the winemaker at Minor Family Winery up in Napa Valley. But we do get fruit from Rosella's Vineyard, Sierra Mar, and Gary's Vineyard.
And last but not least, Adam Lee.
Hey, everybody. I'm Adam. I own and make Clarice wine, Pinot Noirs. I'm also the consulting winemaker for the new Santa Lucia Highlands Pinot Noir for Rombauer Winery. And I get grapes from the northern end to the southern end of the SLH.
Wonderful. So let's dive right in. I want to start off with sharing just a couple of slides so that everybody can kind of orient themselves to the Santa Lucia Highlands and some interesting things of that we have to share from this year. So just a reminder of where we are in Monterey County. We're up against the Sierra de Salinas, right next to the Santa Lucia Range here in the Salinas Valley, where much of the world's produce is grown, certainly the USA produce, very close to the Monterey Bay, which you see up on the upper left as our main influence here in the region. So a couple of things about this season. It is one of the rainiest winter seasons we've had in decades. Low rainfall is pretty typical for the Santa Lucia Highlands. Average would be maybe 10 to 14 inches a year, but this year was something quite different. You can see this photo. This was sunrise one morning this winter with Gonzales River Road totally flooded. I've got another little video here to share with you as well.
It's like we're not going to town today. There's the stop sign at River Road. And there's the lake, which is actually the river.
So that was March 12th. Gary, perhaps you could start us off. Tell us a little bit about this growing season, where things started, and what you saw this winter.
Well, the beauty of all that water you just saw, it was on the valley floor and nothing at all in the Santa Lucia Highlands appellation, where we have beautiful, alluvial fans and slopes. And so our vines were all happy to get all this rain. I always say the vintage starts after harvest as the vines go dormant, and that's when the next vintage starts. And our rainfall, I look back and we had 22.5 inches this past harvest, past winter. It's delayed some of our pruning. It was probably the most rain since 97, 98. The 94, 95 vintage was a flood year as well. So that's how long it went back from, well over 25 years since we've had this much rain. And it continued on with a real cool spring that it rained through early April. And we actually had just really, really cool weather. Bud break came out late, like the first week of April. And normally I would call bud break March 5th to 10th. So right off the bat, we started, because of the wetness and the cool weather, we started off a month later. And I even see on June 6th, we still had 20 hundredths of rain. So that really shows how cool it was going into early June. And I'll probably let someone else take off with the flowering.
Yeah, so Gary, I can talk a little bit more about bud break. You're right, it was about a month late. So we hit bud break here at the Double L in late March, very early April. And yeah, very heavy rains in the winter, but kind of once we started towards the end of spring and into summer, it was fairly typical in terms of rainfall for us. With it, yeah, being just as weather goes, just very cool. We kind of hit flowering early in June, which ended up being pretty good weather, and we got really good fruit set this year too. And I don't know if anyone else saw that across at their vineyards, but it was a good from bud break to flowering is good. And Gwen, do you think you can put up the picture of our vineyard during this time?
Absolutely.
So here's just a little taste of what the Double L looked like in kind of mid-April, and you can see some of the bud break, but what I kind of want to draw attention to is our cover crop behind the vines there, and that cover crop is about waist high, and if I took anything from seeing this in April, I would have cleared my entire schedule for June and July, because I knew that the vines were going to grow just as vigorously, and we're going to have to do a lot of vineyard work to kind of keep them hedged and everything. But so that's kind of a rundown of bud break to flowering.
Gary, maybe you could mention too what all this rain meant in terms of the vineyard and extra time that your teams were in the fields.
Yeah, we expected right away that we're going to have a lot of vigor in the vineyard this year. We really didn't even start. We started watering after Veraison, which is great. You don't want to blow up berries. We expected a lot of water in the berries this year, and maybe heavier cluster weights, and it's turning out to kind of be that way. The canopy management labor bills have been up just to try and slow it down. I mean, even Adam always has an idea, Adam Lee, and left suckers on down below to try and draw more vigor away from the vine. And so we're always doing experiments, and that was one thing that we probably did a little more of this spring because of all the water.
Great.
Yeah, totally.
Perhaps you could chime in and tell us how things are looking at Escol and what you saw through the winter and spring.
Yes, similarly, it was cold and wet. We got about 21 inches compared to a normal of 13. And overall set was solid when it happened, but you don't really see, to Gary's point, how much weight every cluster is going to pick up throughout Veraison all the way until ripening. And just because we're doing bubbles, I actually have, a sample set I've pulled this many acres and this much has come off, and it's definitely continuing to gain weight, as I think there's just extra water still in the soil. And then on top of it, I think the canopy is pushing ripeness at this point because we're so far behind. I'm probably 25, 27 days, depending on block, behind for sparkling, and everything coming off of Escol. It's a relatively representative comparison. It's basically row to row, year over year. And it's one of those things where in that we have such a benefit of phenolic ripeness, where what I'm seeing in base wines and the overall expression in chemistry is 18 tastes like 19, 19 tastes like 20, 21. Just there's a increased complexity and concentration of actual fruit intensity that I think those 25 days bought us, regardless of sugar accumulation over the same period.
Interesting. Let's back up a little bit to Veraison. The Santa Lucia Highlands Vintners and Growers host a somm tour every year. We have 20 to 25 wine buyers from across the country. Usually when we're in the vineyards, the third week of July, we see a lot of color, at least the beginnings, you know, even up to 25%. This year, we saw no color. Gary, tell us a little bit about Veraison and what some of the differences are you're seeing this year.
Well, I always say Veraison is anywhere from 10 days to 30 days, depending on the vintage. And this year, it started exactly a month later. It just pretty much everything's tracking 4 weeks behind. And I like a tighter window. So this one was about 14 days, but it didn't start till the first, I don't know, August 7th or 8th, something like that. And here we are, you know, a month away from harvest still, pretty much. We'll see. We'll see.
Annie, how about you? I know last week when I was at Double L, we still saw some green berries out there.
Yeah, there's a little bit of green still out there. Really, there's not anymore. I was just out there yesterday, and they're catching up really nicely. We went through and we thinned a lot of some of the green fruit that was still remaining, and I think that's really going to help the fruit that's still on the vine really ripen up really nicely over the rest of, you know, the remaining days until we start harvesting here. One of the things that I did notice this year was that we have a lower field and an upper field, and usually our upper field is just a couple of days in front of our lower field in terms of everything, and especially Veraison. And this year it was switched. So I think, you know, there's a lot of, I could speculate a lot on why that is, but it's just kind of interesting given how unique our winter and our spring have been.
Interesting. Gary, I wanted to, that's a good point. You had mentioned that you were seeing some differences in ripening. Typically your vineyards in the south ripen sooner than the vineyards in the north. And it sounds like things are a little topsy-turvy all around.
Yeah, correct. The south is actually behind the north this year, and it never really caught up. I think it's because we had this really cool weather in June and July, and we really didn't have the inversion layers happening in those months, where the higher elevations in the south could be 8 degrees warmer in the nights. And we didn't have that till early August. And normally that's when the south catches up and passes the north, because it's cooler there in the winter and spring in the south, and it just didn't happen. And so we're still tracking the north is ahead. And it's not the first time we've seen it, but over my 25 years, it's probably the second or third time.
Interesting. Let's inquire with our winemakers. Adam, you're out in the vineyards down in the Santa Lucia Highlands, in Santa Barbara, in Sonoma County all the time. What are you noticing different in the SLH and for that matter, some of the other regions that you're traveling and seeing vineyards?
Sure. So one of the things, and mentioning that Annie brought up and then Gary, I think just from a winemaking point of view, we're going to be sampling a lot until we get an order in mind, because normally you would say, okay, we are going to sample the Gary's vineyard, but we don't need to sample the Rosella's vineyard yet because it's a week or 10 days later. Well, that may or may not be the case this year. So I think it's important to, and we're seeing that kind of throughout the state, that's the case. The thing that I really think helped us finally move along, I mean, we were quite cool, as everybody mentioned, and the ground just didn't warm up, and that created a real issue there, and that really helped delay things, or led to the delay of things. But then finally we started getting warmer nights, and in kind of late July and August, and I think that made a huge difference. A lot of times we look at the high temperature for the day and say, oh my gosh, it got really hot, and that's why things moved along. I don't think we haven't had major heat spikes this year at all. Very different than last year. But we finally did get to a point that the lows were higher. And so I actually spent more time this year looking at the high lows, I guess you would say, than at the higher heights of temperature. We are running about a month behind throughout the state. Everywhere that I can say, Murray makes some wine from a vineyard in the Russian River. The last 2 years, she picked August 26th and August 28th. This year, she's on the schedule for the 25th. So we're truly about a month behind. The one place that is not behind, that's ahead, is Oregon. Oregon is picking not just for sparkling, but they are picking for still wines, and are already at 23.5 up to 25 Brix levels. So numbers that I think, certainly knowing Gary would be jealous of being at 23.5 already right now. It's unusual how far ahead Oregon is.
And Michelle, how about you? You are up in Napa Valley at the Miner Family Winery. What are you seeing in Napa, and how does this kind of late harvest with your Pinot Noir affect the rest of your season and your winemaking as things are going to come in? What do you think it's going to look like?
Well, in many ways, the weather here has been very similar. You know, we had a tremendous amount of rain over the winter. I think it was our average for the Napa region is like 27 inches per year, and this past winter we had 40. And then you know, it's been colder than average. We had late bud break, later bloom. So we're also looking at about 3 weeks to a month later than last year, or well, even later than last year. I think there's especially a little bit of whiplash just because a year ago, you know, we were running so far ahead. So this vintage compared to 1 year ago really feels kind of crazy, but I don't think it's totally out there as far as like what we've seen from vintage to vintage. If you look back historically, like 2011, I remember being late, cool. Some of the old timers are telling me about 1999, or we talked about 1994 or 95. So this isn't totally nuts that things have been so delayed, or that they're this cool. And for me, what I'm really seeing is that with this, we're having steady weather. So even though the temperatures have been lower on average than what we've been enjoying the past few years, it's been warm but consistent, and the lows are low but not crazy low. So I'm still seeing ripening. It's just going slower than I would like, because like I would love to have everything just in the cellar right now and be all done. But so I know that when the Pinot Noir that we get from Rosella's vineyard, Gary's vineyard, and then Sierra Mar, when that comes in, it'll probably, you know, be a bit of a workload for the cellar crew, just because they'll also be processing, you know, our Carneros Chardonnay, which is also running way behind. But that's just kind of the name of the game in winemaking. One of the things I'm really seeing that's similar to Napa Valley and similar to Santa Lucia Highlands is there's a real differential when it comes to elevation. So it seems like here I'm seeing on both sides of Napa Valley that the vineyards that are at elevation 1,000 feet or higher went into veraison later, and also seem to be taking longer to get through it. And when I was down at the Santa Lucia Highlands on Thursday last week, I saw Adam Francioni, and also I saw Mark Pizzoni down there, and it sounded like Sierra Mar Vineyard, which is at elevation, was also running behind, which I think is not unusual, but just kind of like there's definitely like a visual difference that you can see that these things are farther apart. So it's just, to me, that's just kind of interesting. I'm anticipating for both appellations, you know, we're not that far away from each other, so the weather hasn't been too different. But with this like steady weather, I'm hoping that we'll just have that like prolonged ripening period where we get to phenolic ripeness without elevated Brixes. Like last year we had very high Brixes. So I'm hoping that means that we're doing less as far as having to mitigate high Brix numbers, hopefully retention of acidity, just because we are having these wonderfully cool nights. And also, you know, just because there's been less sunshine, you know, we have a lot of the marine layer has been sticking around. So less sunshine, less photosynthesis, less sugar accumulation. I'm just hoping that means we're not like doing things in a hurry. We can take our time. That's what I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, Michelle, 1999 was my all-time favorite vintage. So if it turns out like 1999,
Yeah.
it's great. 2011 was one of my most challenging vintages because we got rain in early October. And so it's not the greatest analogy, but I'm like, this years like this tend to be like a hen laying an egg on a very steep pointed roof right at the top. It's going to roll really hard one direction or the other, but we just don't know which way yet.
Yeah, it's still really early. You know, I mean, we're weeks out from picking Pinot Noir. For us, the first thing to come in will be the 777 clone from Rosella's Vineyard, which is typically the first thing that we receive. So there's nothing out of the ordinary going on. And, you know, it's, you know, 1999 was a wonderful vintage, and 2011 was too, you know, despite the challenges. You know, once those wines had aged for a few years, people were saying wonderful things. And I think we shouldn't forget about the beauty of wine partially comes from these differences that we're seeing from, you know, appellation to appellation, but also vintage to vintage. We want things to be different. And so I'm actually really excited to kind of see how everything turns out this year, because it'll be different than the past few years we've had of, you know, warm weather. So.
Great. Well, let's dive in, because there are actually grapes coming in the Santa Lucia Highlands, and Scott Carcioli can give us the rundown on the sparkling wine harvest. Scott, let her rip. Tell us what's happening.
So we started I think it was the 28th of August, 29th of August, which was, I think, 25 days behind those same rows in 2021. Kind of throw 2022 out with how light the crop was and hot it was running up to it. And that is pretty uniform across most of the blocks that we harvested. We finished about 8 hours ago. And it was one of those things where the last 5 days, 60% of the fruit came in. And of the 70 tons, it was one of a ripening homogeny, where the things were 2 bricks apart. And then most of them ended up right similarly in terms of acid retention and also overall sugar accumulation, right around the numbers that we look to harvest sparkling. So it's been kind of full bore every day for the last 5 or so, but the quality is really high, extremely high. The acid retention is awesome. I have lots that are 12.5, 13 acid. And the ability to actually predict the bricks, while it's a little bit difficult because you always kind of want to pull the trigger when you're sitting around waiting, the change day to day has been so slow because it's been cool and the nights have been so cool that we're able to know kind of in 2 days where it's going to be. Sparkling is one of those things where there's usually a right day, even more so than still wine, and you can get it wrong from a multitude of chemistries. So it's definitely been nice that it's been a slow vintage by comparison to 2022, and getting everything off, even though it came in together, was possible by kind of seeing that it was going to align that way, especially with the early lots we brought in.
And since you're getting the first look, tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of yields.
It's probably average plus. It's kind of a weird, I mean, my sample set's somewhat limited. It's probably 35%, 40% of the vineyard. But there's small yielding clones that are going plus 15% of what you would normally expect. And I have larger yielding clones that are going 20% less, and I have some that are going 20% more. So it's very, I believe, kind of contingent upon where in the vineyard it is. Ascol doubles in elevation, while it's not a huge elevation difference. Where the fog sits is very playing, I think, in the way things kind of overall overall set, and also accumulated moisture over the year to the fact that they're still running. I haven't irrigated anything on a skull this vintage with all the rain last year, and I try not to. So when they have that horsepower in the soil, they tend to pull it and kind of run, especially as we start to get closer to 19 bricks. And also the cluster weights kind of ran with sugar accumulation. It was relatively linear when I was mapping it and testing everything.
Well, we're very excited to see it yet another vintage of your beautiful sparkling wines. Thank you for the update there. Let's move over to Pinot Noir. So Pinot Noir makes up more than 3,500 of the 5,700 acres of grapes in the Santa Lucia Highlands. It's really important to the Santa Lucia Highlands, probably what we're best known for. Let's talk about Pinot Noir. Gary, tell us a little bit about what this long, cool season means for Pinot.
Oh, it's probably classic, what you really want, because everybody talks about hang time and when all the flavor development happens. And there's nothing better than to have all of September to develop those flavors and really get into probably mid-October when it's really cool and you don't have bricks moving rapidly on you. There's less chance of a heat wave come October, and there's shorter days. So if you do get an 80-degree day, that's exactly what you want. I'm really feeling that the 2023 vintage could be just a fabulous, fabulous vintage if we get a dry October. And if we can include an Indian summer, I'm asking for a lot. It'll just make this spectacular, because 99 is also my favorite vintage. It was one of the first ones we harvested. And I remember we started October 1 and we were nervous all of September because you're supposed to harvest grapes in September. But October 1 came and we had this spectacular 3 weeks of Indian summer that it was just clear. The mornings were just really cool and clear, just spectacular. And the afternoons might have touched 80. So the ripening was just perfect. And we got the whole vintage in 3 weeks. So I'm hoping we match that again.
Wonderful. Annie, tell us a little bit about Double L, what you're seeing in Pinot Noir. Maybe also kind of touch on Scott's point about what you're seeing in the different clones you have planted there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, hang time is everything, right? It's Gary and Scott, they said it better than I can. I think also with the longer, cooler, more steady summer that we've had and going into especially this harvest season, I think it also allows us to kind of pick and choose when we harvest. And we have the Double L, we harvest everything by hand. And so we're kind of, it's, if we have a real hot couple of days or weeks and we have to pull everything in quick, it's a little bit hard to make it exactly when we want to pull the fruit in. And so by having kind of a nice steady lead up to harvest, we're really working with our winemaking team and making the best decision on when we're going to pull the fruit in. And that's clonal too. We usually harvest one clone at a time. And so we're monitoring the different clones and really picking them at their peak ripeness so we could get some good wine out of them. So really looking forward to the 2023 vintage. And just for fun, I pulled an old tech sheet from a 1995 Pinot Noir that we made and see if this sounds familiar at all. The hallmark of this vintage was a long, cool summer that let the fruit hang on the vine longer for more concentration of flavor. I wish I had fruit quality of this level every vintage. So I think we're in for a really great vintage this year.
Scott, what about you? In addition to your sparkling program, obviously you're making still wines too. How much longer do you think you have for that? And are you seeing any particular noteworthy things in your Pinot for your still wines?
Everything that I'm seeing is, like, from a fruit quality perspective, is true, whether it's sparkling or still. I'll probably start, I'm guessing probably the end of next week, people will start to pull fruit, but it's a block that was ahead. It's what I pulled in. It's the same block I pulled in August of the end of August for sparkling. It's Clone 943. It's always the first one. And then I have a few other 943 blocks that are right behind it, and also some 115 that'll probably be going in 2 weeks. More or less. I have some stuff at 22 right now, and some most everything for Pinot is probably at least 20. Chardonnay is probably 2 bricks behind it. So it's Chardonnay won't start for a month. Pinot will start soon, then it'll kind of lag off, and then it'll come on strong in 2.5, 3 weeks, is my guess. Clonally.
That sounds good. Well, let's ask the winemakers. Adam, why don't you give us a little sense of, what might be different for you in the winery this year, and kind of what you're seeing when you're out in the field that makes you think, okay, I'm going to have to try this or try this. How does that look?
Sure. So I make my wine at a custom crush facility, and so share with a bunch of different people. One of the things that could be concerning would be, I think a lot of things like Napa Cab and all of that are not that far behind the Pinot from Santa Lucia. So I think there's going to be a little bit of competition for tanks. And so that could be a challenge. One of the best things I'm seeing, and it's kind of shown here, is the lignification that is going on. This is at the Rosella's Vineyard. And if you take a look at the shoots and how dark and woody they have become, that certainly tells you that the vines are not really putting energy any longer into growing a lot of canopy. It then usually translates into the lignification of the stems of the grapes as well. Ultimately, it also leads to brown seeds. All in all, I think that allows for a year where the opportunity to do a lot of whole cluster is something that I think works very, very well. Whole cluster also will, if you have very high acidity, which we might have some good acids this year, being as cool as it's been, that will help mitigate some of that acid as well, and that can help balance it out. But I think this sign is great. The other thing we are going to have to think about is that there is some concentration that comes with alcohol, and I am guessing that this is going to be a somewhat lower alcohol, lower bricks, and then consequently lower alcohol year. So I'm going to be doing more cold soak, letting it sit on the skins early, and try to get a little more overall time on the skins, which will make the people where I make the wine at that custom crush facility pissed off at me, because they don't want, they're going to want the tank. But it's, I think, something that could really be useful this year.
If I may chime in, and Scott or Annie, let me know what you guys are seeing in your vineyards. But this year we saw lignification in that picture before Veraison. And I'm thinking that can also be a great indicator for a great vintage due to some of the things Adam says that he can do in the winery. But I was excited to see that, because lignification is so important, to get into the seeds. So hopefully that all turns out. It's exciting.
I was seeing it at about 15 bricks, with Veraison at like 18 and change, 17 and change, depending on clone. So same thing. And it was noteworthy. You watched it, like you walk it and you can see, and you eat berries and there's so much acid in them, but everything's going brown. It's a little bit, it's a juxtaposition that you notice just walking the vine.
Yeah,
Agreed.
we've seen a little bit of that too here at the Double L, and it's really interesting to watch just how the season's playing out.
Michelle, how about you? Tell us a little bit about what you think this means in the winery for you.
Yeah, I'm actually excited probably to do very little as far as winemaking. I think this vintage has the potential for wines that are very balanced. Wines are made in the vineyard. I think the biggest challenge this year was probably botrytis and mold pressures, but I know that everyone who farms in the Santa Lucia Highlands is doing a lot of work to kind of make sure that that's not an issue, whether that's leafing appropriately or, you know, cluster thinning where necessary. So everything I saw looked beautiful. So for me, if this fruit comes in with lower Brix's, lower sugar, good acidity, that means I don't have to do as much. We ferment, we do spontaneous fermentations, wild fermentations. So we don't add yeast. We just kind of like let that happen naturally after a few days of cold soaking. So I'm really excited to see what we can pull out with the extraction during fermentation. And yeah, not having to add water, not having to add tartaric acid, I feel like that will I'm expecting beautiful wines. I'm just like so excited to see that I don't have to manipulate things. This is a vintage where it's just going to be what is from the vineyard is what we're pouring into our glass later. So yeah, it's a funny question because I'm just like, I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to watch. That's my hope, my intention. So
you're already making our mouths water. Let's move on and talk a little bit about Chardonnay. You know, we kind of did it in this order because in the Santa Lucia Highlands, typically Pinot Noir begins coming in before Chardonnay. Annie, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what's happening in your Chardonnay at Double L. I'll share a little bit too.
Yeah, it's you know, the Chardonnay is tasting really good. Everything's tasting really good, and I probably, you know, I am in the vineyard a lot, doing a lot of stuff there, and I eat grapes all day long. Probably so much so that I forget lunch. But the Chardonnay has been, I think Michelle mentioned it, you know, the mildew pressure is something that we had to watch for this year with our Chardonnay, especially since we are certified organic. Staying on top of that has been very labor intensive. We, you know, went through and heavily hedged and deleafed and stayed on top of that. But in my mind, it's, you know, being out there and spending all day on the mower, the deleafer, it's a labor of love, because I know that the hours that we put into the vineyard are going to result in good quality grapes and wine on the backside. And I think that's what we're looking at in terms of Chardonnay. And it's, I mean, the ripening story is kind of the same as Pinot. It's slow, but it's going really nicely as we get near harvest time.
Scott, how about you? Any specific thoughts on Chardonnay?
I think it's going to be a vintage that picking Chardonnay is dependent on TA, not Brix, even maybe more so than Pinot, just because it's running behind it. So I have a feeling that it's going to, especially at a skull, get to a point where it's going to only ripen so far, and you're only going to lose acid in terms of what you're gaining in sugar.
Gary, what about you? You've got Chardonnay at what, 3 out of the 4 vineyards you're farming?
Yeah, I don't know what's going on, but my Chardonnay's running a little ahead of my Pinots. I agree with Scott on his theory. But I think everything's going to come in that 2 to 2.5 week period from October 5th to October 20th or something like that. It's a short window, so you're going to see it. I think you're going to see Pinot and Chard coming in I mean, Pinot started off, but Chardonnay will come in before the Pinot finishes.
Unusual. Well, there's not a lot of Syrah in the Santa Lucia Highlands, but I thought it's especially important to chat about that in a year like this, where it's such a long season, it's such a late year. Syrah tends to be the latest varietal, and especially those of you in the north, Skull Vineyard, Scott and Annie at Double L. I've heard you in the past talk about how challenging it can be in cool years to get your Syrah ripened. Let's talk a little bit about that. You know, there's only 50 to 60, maybe 60 acres of Syrah in the SLH. Those of you who know it's delicious, it's beautiful. But what kind of challenges this year posing for Syrah, Annie?
The challenge this year is that the vines are heavily fruited, and so we're going through, and you can look at the picture, you can see that we've already done one fruit thin on them, and we'll go through again next week and thin again. So really taking off a lot of fruit so that the vine has the opportunity to ripen the remaining fruit on the vine with the cool weather that we have. So that's gonna be a challenge. And it's always, I go through and I do some of this too, along with our workers, and it's always hard cutting fruit off the vine, but it's gonna pay out in the end when we get some really nice Syrah grapes, I think.
I'm similarly dropping fruit. I've done one pass, I'll do another. It's not necessarily different from what I would do in a normal vintage. The timing of it is different. But it's kind of just Syrah wants to fruit, especially at a skull, and kind of getting it to that balanced crop load for the canopy usually takes dropping right around Veraison ending, and then dropping now if I have any green clusters that are lagging and noticeably behind, that would kind of skew the overall pot. I mean, we can also cross our fingers and hope we don't hit weather, and that would be really ideal, because I would think that there's a very high likelihood that Syrah comes in November, maybe the second week of November possibly. So that's a lot of rain to dodge.
Gary, what year was it? Was it 2002 that we picked Rosella Syrah, like November 8th, something like that?
I was just going to chime in. Yeah, there's been 2 vintages. I had November 7th, November 10th.
Yeah.
And I, like Scott, we're going to be November there. But I don't think we're as far behind, because I always call Syrah in the Santa Lucia Highlands it's really a cool climate grape here, because King City, 20 miles south, generally harvests 60 days before our Syrah here. And I always count on Syrah like the last week of October, around there. I call it a Halloween, many times Halloween, but it's really not that far behind, because Veraison, I track it's normally around September 1, or we finished Veraison around September 1. And this year that Veraison is pretty close to that. And I kind of got scared, and early on, I think in mid-August, before Veraison was just barely starting, berry by berry. And I went down and took, I went down to 18 clusters per vine, like 2-1, 2-1 per shoot. So I wanted to get that jump on it. So we'll see how it turns out. But yeah, I agree. We're in November.
Going to be a late one for you then. For all of you out there, if you have any other questions, please drop them in the chat. I think we've covered most of our program today. Any of you guys have extra thoughts or last predictions or any bets you want to make on harvest?
It's going to be a great one. Can't wait. We just got to wait. The hardest part about waiting is waiting.
Yeah, I'm very excited, very encouraged at the potential out there.
And it's interesting because we talk a lot about weather. It's all weather drives everything. And I think we have a lot of people tuning in from outside of the Central Coast. And it's amazing how different their experiences have been with this summer, right? Everywhere else has been so hot, just heat wave after heat wave in the summer. And even, if you look at California itself, I mean, we had a hurricane hit Southern California this year, and kind of none of that affected us up here in the Santa Lucia Highlands. And so it's just it's fun that this vintage is so insular. And I think, Adam, you said it well with Oregon is pulling in grapes before we are, and it's just very unique what's happening here on the Central Coast.
Yeah, I think it's going to be great. I think we're just going to have amazing balanced wines, and especially after 2022 being what it was, I think it'll be wonderful to be able to see how vintage by vintage of wine or a vineyard can be different, because that's part of the beauty of wine, is just being able to really kind of see that place at that time. So
well said.
Indeed. And Annie, I think you make a great point, and it just, reminds me to kind of drive home that one of the beautiful things about the Santa Lucia Highlands is this consistency of this climate. So even though this year is a long, slow year, it's still really even, really steady. That influence from the Monterey Bay keeps it cool, keeps it slow, keeps it low and long. And that's really just such a hallmark of the quality and the consistency of the wines from this region. So that's exciting that, you know, once again, we're going to have a tremendous vintage. I just also want to remind everybody, you know, these beautiful folks that have taken their time out of their busy season to represent and talk about the harvest, really on behalf of all of the growers. You know, we have 50 vineyards in the Santa Lucia Highlands, probably about 34 owners of all those 50 vineyards. But that's just a fraction of the small artisan producers that make wine from the Santa Lucia Highlands, from Scott's Vineyard, from all Gary's different vineyards. There are, you know, dozens and dozens of producers that are pulling fruit from the Santa Lucia Highlands. So on behalf of everybody here today, thank you so much for representing all the wonderful wines and wineries that are produced from your beautiful vineyards. Let's raise a toast. If you've got anything in your glass, let's make a toast to the 2023 harvest. We're thrilled that everybody could join us today. We're also looking forward to coming back, not leaving this as a cliffhanger, but coming back in November and giving you an update with some real solid answers. What was it like? How did things go? What do we expect now that we've got some wine in tanks and hopefully move into barrel after that? So we're excited. It'll be a great year. Cheers, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really pleased to have you. And here's to a wonderful 2023 season.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.